The first instruction, actually it was a little bit of sauce. I remember the first day that I cooked, I was very nervous. And I prepared things and I took them in and put them on his table. He had a little buzzer that he would ring for the servant to come. So I served him his lunch, waited, and when he rang the buzzer, I came in to take his plates and I took them out to the kitchen and I forgot to wipe the spot on his desk. So after a few minutes he rang his buzzer and I came back in and he said, "You've forgotten to wipe the spot." And I said, "I'm sorry, Prabhupada," and I went and got a cloth. The next day I forgot again. And when I came in, he rang his buzzer and I came in and he was strong. He said, "You have forgotten again." And I remember I took it seriously, but I took it lightly. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Prabhupada. I'll go do it." And my take on it is that he saw that I wasn't really ready for some heavy chastisement. So for months and months and months after that, I never got chastised for anything else. And I always remembered to wipe the spot.
That's probably why.
I remember one morning early on, he said, "Can you make halava?" And I hadn't had much Vedic cooking experience. I was a cook by nature, but hadn't done much before I'd done this work. And so I said, "I really don't know the recipe, but I'll call the temple and find out what the recipe is." And so I called the temple, couldn't find anyone who knew what the recipe was. I knew what the ingredients were, but the amounts I didn't know. So coming from a healthy, hippie kind of background, one of the reasons I didn't join the temple was I didn't want to give up raw diet. And I remember my first donation to the temple, my first service, was a 50-pound can of honey because I felt like we shouldn't be eating sugar. So I speculated and I made halava with honey. And if anyone knows, you end up with something you could play baseball with. So I remember I made this preparation, I put it in the bowl, and I took it in with his breakfast, and he didn't touch it. There was one small dent out of the corner where he was able to get his spoon into it a little bit. And he was very kind, he didn't say anything to me about it. Later on, Kartikeya Swami made halava that came out fluffy and light, and Prabhupada ate 2 or 3 servings. He said, "This is halava, find out the recipe." So I did. And just for the record, 2½ water, 1 farina, 1 butter, and 1 1/3 sugar. And the extra water, it was more than what the recipe book called for, but it made it very light. So I've always made halava with that recipe since. Never honey again. The main thing was cleanliness and punctuality. As a matter of fact, he reiterated that over and over, that is the prime prerequisite for a cook or a pujari, is cleanliness and punctuality. Even later on, I remember once in India, we were traveling, Jamuna and Guru Das and the original group of devotees that went to India. We would go to villages. We would stay in wealthy people's homes, and then we would go out for engagements in villages. And once we went to a village, and they took us to the local Krishna temple, and it was just a little small, hole-in-the-wall kind of a place. And the altar was very dirty. The pujari was wild. He had his front teeth missing, and he would offer very quickly and then turn around and throw the water in our faces. And the main thing was the cleanliness. I saw that it was just very unkempt. So as we were leaving, I asked Prabhupada in the car, I said, "Srila Prabhupada, I have a question about this temple." He said, "Ask me later." So later, when there was no one else there, he said, "What is your question about the temple?" And I said, "Well, you've taught us that cleanliness is essential in deity worship. And this temple was very dirty. And I just wondered, is Krishna really there?" And he said, "Yes, Krishna is there." He said, "Our standard is cleanliness. You keep that standard. Don't judge anyone else by what they do." And he several times during the time I was with him, he either said to me or I heard him say, all the rules and regulations are meant for us to apply on ourselves alone, not to judge anybody else. He said, I saw that pujari, said he was very different, but his heart was for Krishna, and therefore that's what we see. Well, it's embarrassing to say this in front of all the assembled Vaishnavas, but Prabhupada did tell me one time that I was the king of fault finders. Because he would give me a teaching, and my deepest internal intent was to share it. And somehow, because of my ego, when I would share it, it would sound like fault finding, and there was some of that there. So one of his instructions to me was to give that up, to really take all the instructions and apply them right here, and not worry what anybody else is doing. I remember one morning, it was a chilly morning in Los Angeles, and Prabhupada would wear his kurta, and then he had 2 chadors put together that he would wear. And one morning I was a little late in getting the car ready, and I ran out and all I had was a kurta on. So we were walking in Cheviot Hills Park, and I would always walk a couple steps behind him. So I was walking, I was cold, but I was walking along, and Prabhupada turned around, and so, just like a brother, he said, "You're cold. Here, take one of these." And he took off his chadors and pulled them apart. I said, "No, no, Prabhupada, I'm okay." He said, "No, no, you're cold. Wear this." And I, again, I said, "Prabhupada, these are your chadors." He said, "No, wear it. You're cold." So I took his chador and wore it for the rest of the walk. So kind, my feeling was so much awe and reverence, and he accepted that because that's Lord Chaitanya's instruction, is to be the guru, and that that's how he can assist me to develop love for Krishna, and his heart was just so much there and present. When I was with Prabhupada in Los Angeles, I would drive him on the morning walk, just he and I, every morning. And one morning he would go to Venice Beach and walk at the beach. One morning he would go to Cheviot Hills Park and walk in the park. And one morning he would go to a very wealthy part of Beverly Hills and walk in the very expensive homes around a big block. So there was this one house with a large plate glass window in the front, and they had a giant German Shepherd who would always come biting at the window. So one morning as we passed, they let the dog out the front door. And he came charging across the lawn. I'm speculating they had a collar on him that had a perimeter, because he came up to the edge of the grass but didn't come onto the sidewalk. I didn't know that. And I remember my thought is, I'm going to be seriously injured or die here, and it's in Prabhupada's service, and that's okay. So the dog was running across the lawn, Prabhupada was walking with his cane, and the dog came up to the edge, so I turned around to face the dog and stay in between the dog and Prabhupada. And he was barking and snarling at me. And I was there for a few seconds, and I glanced over my shoulder, and Prabhupada had very nonchalantly just kept walking, hadn't hardly paid any attention to what was going on. And so the dog was stopped, still barking, but he was stopped. So I turned around and ran to catch up to Prabhupada, and the dog trailed me along the edge of the grass. And as I caught up to Prabhupada, he turned around and took a wide stance, like a martial arts stance, lifted his cane over his head, and said, "Hut!" And the dog's tail went between his legs. He immediately turned and ran back to the house. And I was amazed. I was amazed and not amazed also. But Prabhupada said, if you take a stick to an animal and give them a hut, they will generally, you don't have to hit them, but they will generally get the message and go on. So years later, we were in India. We were in Jaipur, staying at the palace of the king of Jaipur. And in Jaipur they have, I think they're called langurs, big monkeys, Hanuman monkeys, with the real long tail. And the place that Prabhupada's quarters were was around the base of a big bathing ghat. We could see the palace across, and there was this walled bathing ghat that had been built. The ghat was in the roof. And it was a circular part. Prabhupada had a room, and then there was a covered veranda, and a small room that had been his kitchen, was his kitchen. And a monkey had torn the door off the kitchen and eaten all the boga. So they had replaced the door, and I was in Prabhupada's room within a day or so after that happening, and we always kept a stick by the door. So the room was filled with Indian guests and devotees, and we heard this rattling sound. So I looked out the door, and there was a monkey trying to take the door off this room. So I picked up the stick and went outside, and I remembered the dog. I remembered what Prabhupada had told me. So I was about 10 feet away, and he was bent over and down. So as I came up, he heard me and turned around and stood up, and I went, "Hut!" And he looked at me and puffed his chest up and bared his teeth and started walking towards me. And he was almost as tall as I was. And I turned around and ran back into Prabhupada's room. It was so strange, the human-like face. It was very strange. And I went back in Prabhupada's room and opened the door and came in real quick, and he knew exactly, and so did everyone else, what had happened. And he just broke out laughing. He laughed. He said, "You do not know the process." He said, "If you had gone to him one more time," he was testing you, "if you had just one more time said hut, he would have stopped." So I got my second lesson on animal training from Prabhupada. I remember also walking on the beach. One day he was walking along and a wave that was particularly big broke and came up, and he had to jump and dance out of the way. And I said, "Srila Prabhupada, even the ocean wants to touch your lotus feet." And he laughed, and I don't remember his exact words, but it was very, very humble. He took that glory that had been given to him and turned it to Krishna. I saw him do that so many times, so many times. A couple of times in the temple in Los Angeles. Once on his birthday, he came in from his morning walk and walked in, paid his obeisances to the deities, and went and sat on the Vyasasan, and one by one the devotees spoke about the glories of Prabhupada. And of course everyone was speaking how he had saved their lives and how he was saving the world by bringing Krishna consciousness. And he just listened, he accepted with his eyes closed. He was just listening. And then when the last person had spoken and Prabhupada was going to speak, there was a very long silence. He was very quiet for a long time. And you could have heard a pin drop. And you could see the ecstatic symptoms in his body that he was not allowing to fully manifest. But there was some tears coming and he was shivering. And he said, "I thank you," when he finally spoke, he said, "I thank you all so much for your praise and how much you show your love for me." He said, "But truly I have to say that I am just the servant of my beloved Guru Maharaj, and all this is happening by his grace. I am simply his servant, and I'm trying to do what he asked me to do. And it is his grace that is allowing this to happen." And then he stopped, and there was more tears. And then he said, "And actually, all of you are my gurus." He said, "My Guru Maharaj has given me this service to do, and I came here with very little, and it is because of you that this is going on. So I offer you my respects as my gurus." When we were traveling in India, at one point we went to Surat, and we were guests in the home of an elder banker gentleman named Bhagubai Jariwala. And we had been challenged by being always fed very opulent prasadam, which then translated into dysentery for most of us. And so we were at this man's home, and they were very adamant about seconds and thirds and really serving us nicely. And most everyone was sick. And we were there for a while, a couple of weeks, and not being trained in the Vedic system from birth, we weren't quite up to standard. We didn't, many of us were ill, and the cleanliness standard was not very high in our little ashram in his house. And there were many things that he could have found fault with. Sometimes an occasional devotee would be rude, or I remember sometimes people calling for more prasadam, hey, bring me more. And so when we left his home, on the last day he came and he gave each devotee an envelope with 51 rupees in it, and which was big for us at that time. That was something no one had ever done. And then he spoke, and he was a little man, small body, thin, beautiful. He was in his 70s, had beautiful clear eyes, and just this loving countenance. And he spoke, and he said, I am so honored that you have all been here at my home. It has been such an honor to serve you. He said, and I really hope, and he started crying. He said, I really hope that you can forgive me for all the offenses I've committed against you. And then he sobbed. And Prabhupada looked over at us, and his eyes opened up, and he said, this is an example of a Vaishnava. He said, this is the quality of a Vaishnava. Once, when Prabhupada was in London, I was outside the temple, and there was a nun, an elder nun, walking by on the street with her garb. She was a Carmelite, which I believe the Carmelites are vegetarians. And I said, Hare Krishna, and she said, Hare Krishna. She was an elder woman. And she stopped to talk to me. And we talked for a minute, and I said, our spiritual master is here. Would you like to meet him? And she said, I'd be honored to. So I brought her in the temple, and I went in Prabhupada's room, and I said, Prabhupada, there's a Christian nun here who I was speaking to, and she's anxious to meet you. He said, oh, bring her in. So she came in, and as I came back in with her, I paid my obeisances. She paid her obeisances. She bowed down, put her head on the floor. And Prabhupada looked up, and he was beaming. And they sat and talked for 10 or 15 minutes about Christianity and Krishna consciousness in total agreement, total accord. He would say something about our philosophy. She would say, yes, Prabhupada. And Jesus said, and Prabhupada would say, yes, and Krishna said. So for 10 minutes, this dialogue of interfaith went on. And she then said, Prabhupada, I'm so grateful to have met you. I really appreciate this connection, and I don't want to take any more of your time. I know you have a lot to do, so may I take my leave? And he said, yes, thank you very much. And then he looked to me and he said, give her this garland. He had his garland on the desk. So I walked over, and she paid her obeisances again. And as she was coming up, I gave her the garland. And it was so beautiful to see the interchange. Many times I saw Prabhupada do that with people of other faiths. He could always see the heart of a person, and would find that way to see the similarities. And if he saw in the heart of a person that they hadn't really gotten it yet, of whatever faith they were in, sometimes he would be a little strong with them. But if someone was sincere, he was always finding that way to see the similarities rather than any differences. And I remember in London at the same time, Prabhupada's room was on the second floor, I believe, of the temple in Bury Place, second or third floor. And just off of his rooms was the secretary's office. It was almost like a closet, a long closet. Shamashundar was his secretary at that time. And one day I was doing some typing. Sometimes Prabhupada would let me do some minor secretarial stuff. And I was typing and this head popped in the door and said, "Hello, Shamshunda there?" in an English accent. And I looked over and I said, "No, he's not here now." And I looked back, I went typing and then I did a double take because it was George Harrison. And I recognized him. And I said, "He's not here, but Prabhupada's here and I'm sure he'd like to see you." And he said, "Oh, I don't want to bother him." I said, "I don't think it'd be a bother." And so I went in the room and I said, "Prabhupada, George Harrison is here." And he said, "Oh, send him in." So I went out and he was waiting outside and I said, "He wants to see you." And he started taking his shoes or socks off, something, and he said, "I get so nervous when I go to see Prabhupada." He said, "Actually, I just got my hair cut to see him." He had had long hair and a beard and he had cut it short. And so he went in and closed the door. And I stayed outside for a couple of seconds and was just too curious. So I opened the door and George was dandabat, flat on the floor, saying the prayers in Sanskrit. And so I went in and paid my obeisances and he sat back by the door. And Prabhupada's desk was on the other side of the room and he said, "No, come closer, come closer." So George kind of inched his way forward, very humble, very humble. And Prabhupada said, "No, no, not there, here." And he patted behind his desk. So George came around behind the desk and Prabhupada, as soon as he was within reach, he reached out and grabbed him and pulled him in and hugged him, put his head on his chest and was messing his hair up. He said, "It is so good to see you, so good to see you. How is your wife, Patty?" George said, "Very good, Prabhupada." So they spoke and George actually asked him, he said, "Prabhupada, I've been thinking whether or not I should join the temple or shave my head and actually take up full practice." Prabhupada said, "No, no, no." He said, "You have a great gift. You have a place in the world where you can spread Krishna consciousness in a big way." He said, "Rather you stay where you are and adapt Krishna consciousness into your music." He said, "I will teach you some of the songs." So George, and next day he came and brought Ravi Shankar. And for a week they would come. George came every day, Ravi Shankar came 2 or 3 times. And Prabhupada would get out Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's songbook and go through it with George and find songs and give him essences, give him some of the essences to use in his music. And it was such a loving exchange. It was really a beautiful thing to see. There were 2 times where Prabhupada and Yogi Bhajan met together. And Prabhupada was very strong about the purity of Krishna conscious philosophy and very much aware of the loopholes in many of the philosophies that were preached by Indian gurus. But with Yogi Bhajan, there was a real brotherhood. When Yogiji would come to see Prabhupada, they would laugh, they would tell jokes, they talked about the upcoming world situation. Yogi Bhajan was very heavy about it. He said, "Prabhupada, the streets, my vision is the streets of the major cities of America will be rivers of blood." And Prabhupada said, "Yes, there is a lot coming." And then Prabhupada said to him on one occasion, "You Sikhs have always protected us Vaishnavas." He said, "We are the Brahmins, you are the Kshatriyas. You are the ones that came to Vrindavan and saved the temples and saved the devotees. And similarly, when this world situation increases, our movements will join together." And it was a very nice seeing of acceptance by seeing the spirit of a person, acceptance of someone of another, apparently another faith. One thing that comes to mind is there was a time when Prabhupada was having some physical challenges. And I had come from a sort of a health food background. And there was a doctor in India that also said, "No, Prabhupada should eat raw food." I thought, yes, this is good. This is good. I can do that. I can make raw food preparations. And so I told Prabhupada that. I said, this person has suggested eating a very light diet, no ghee, and he said, well, I can do this. I will do this. So I thought, oh, this is going to be really good. This, his health will become strong. And I prepared one meal like that, and he ate. He said, this was very good. And the next morning, morning prasad was almost always just fruit, simple things. And so I said, what would you like for lunch? And he said, dal, rice, chapatis, halava. and I asked him about the raw diet. He said, since I was a child, I have always loved prasadam, and I'm not going to give it up now. He said, Krishna will protect me. I will eat prasadam and Krishna will protect me. Then, along those lines, there was a time when I was feeling a little bit challenged in my body. I was feeling that ghee and sugar and some of the general fare was too heavy. I would tend to sleep or I would get sick. And when I ate very light food, I would be healthy. And devotees told me, that's Maya, that if you take prasadam, Krishna will bless you. Whatever you get is just a tiny fragment of your karma. So devotees just eat prasadam and they don't worry about health food stuff. So that makes sense. That's philosophically sound. But still, the practical day-to-day stuff was, if I ate a light diet, I served a lot better. I was a lot clearer. So I asked Prabhupada, remembering what he had said for himself. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, when I eat light, it's easier. When I eat heavy, it's heavier. And I understand the principle of just taking prasadam and accepting Krishna's mercy. What should I do? And I was fully ready to do whatever he told me to do. And he said, you should just take prasadam if you're Rupa Goswami. He said, but if you're a neophyte, which all of you are, you have to decide what is good for your devotional service and what is not good for your devotional service. Then I asked him, I said, well, how, if I'm feeling sick and I need to eat something other than what's offered to the deities, how do I offer it? How do I feel like I'm taking prasadam? And he said, if you need to prepare something simpler than what's being prepared for the deities, you prepare it at the same time, you set it aside in a place, it doesn't go on the altar, but it's set aside, and after the offering is over, it's also offered. He said, but you can't make better than Krishna. He said, if you have to take simple, you can do it that way, but you can't make opulent without offering. When we were in Bombay, we were staying in a place called Chembur. It was kind of out on the suburbs of Bombay. And it was in that initial time when there was the original group of devotees. And it was very sweet. We would all go in Prabhupada's room every morning and in the evening also, and it was just dialogue. It was very confidential and open. So the whole mood was really nice. One afternoon, I made paneer, fresh paneer, without pressing it. And I offered it with his fruit offering at 4 o'clock. I put a little honey on top and a little cinnamon or something. And I took it in and he ate about half the bowl. And he didn't comment, but I saw that he had eaten quite a bit. So I thought, oh, I found something that Prabhupada likes. So the next day I made it again. And I took it in, and when I came to get his tray, there was 1 bite gone. So I thought, well, maybe he's not in the mood for it today. So a 3rd day, I made it again. And when I came in to get his plate, he hadn't touched it. And he said, the paneer is very nice, very tasty. But he said, as brahmacharis, he said, we can only eat paneer once a week. He said, otherwise, sex desire. He moved his hand. So that was the paneer instruction. Kartikeya Swami's mother had cancer and was passing away. And he went to be with her. And as she was taking her last breath, she looked up at him and said, "Is your Krishna with me now?" She died. And Prabhupada said when he heard this, he was just so grateful and so loving with Kartikeya. He said, "You have saved your mother." He said, your devotion, even though his mother was not favorable before that, her last words were, "Is your Krishna here now?" And Prabhupada said, "Your mother has gone back to Godhead because of you." One time we were in Bombay, and it was one of those times where, not by any qualification, but just by that blessing of Krishna and Guru, you get a little taste of what transcendental energy really is. We went to a village and I set up a table, and many of the elder women got really into it. They were getting flowers and they were really in a worshipful mood. So Prabhupada was sitting on the Vyasasana and we had the kirtan and I was doing the pujari work, and I really felt like I was serving Krishna. I could feel the love in the offering. Generally it was done in a good mood, and there was a limit on the consciousness. And this one time Prabhupada opened the lid, and the arti went on for close to an hour. And as I was offering the different items, I was actually feeling it. I was feeling the connection with Krishna and Radha. And as I was fanning, I remember getting chills in my body that, it was ecstatic. And I knew it was a gift. And as I turned around to fan Prabhupada, he was smiling. He was right watching me, and he was smiling very big. And after the arti was over and the prayers had been said, I took the water and the flour over to him, and I was still feeling this. And I offered him the flour and I sprinkled the water on his head, and he looked up at me and he said, "Thank you so much." And I melted. I hit the floor. I started crying. It was a wonderful gift of, this is what it's like to serve Krishna. Now work for it. When we went to India, we did Pandal programs, the Cross Maidan that Radhanath Swami was talking about, and often we would do programs like that. And inevitably someone would come in a sahajya mood and come usually up front and start chanting and dancing with us and start exhibiting symptoms of ecstasy, crying or falling on the ground. And on a number of occasions, Prabhupada would see, I remember at Cross Maidan, as a matter of fact, an elder, thin man with a shaved head came up and started dancing and doing his brand of ecstasy. And Prabhupada leaned over and told one of the devotees, "Go throw a bucket of water on him," because he saw that it was just a show. And he really encouraged not putting on a show about devotional service. I remember actually when I first joined the temple in Los Angeles, there was a brother there, tall brahmachari, who would go into crying ecstasy every time we'd have a kirtan. At the end, when the prayers were being said, he would be on the floor weeping and crying for Krishna. And I remember thinking, well, I guess that's what we're supposed to do. and I would try and get myself a little bit to be more of a bhakta. And then Prabhupada commented on it one day, not directly at him, he was very kind, but he brought up that, please don't try and imitate the symptoms of advanced devotees, just remain humble. And then I got it, and he left, actually. Coming from a Southern California raw food background, I asked him at one point, when I first moved into the temple, I just surrendered and ate prasad. Then I got to be with Prabhupada, so I had a kitchen that I could do what I wanted. So I wanted to make sure that I was not going against what Prabhupada would want me to do. And I was eating salads and fruits and simple food. And so one day I decided I should ask him about it and make sure it was okay. So I asked him about raw diet as opposed to taking prasad. He said, actually, raw diet is the best diet for Krishna consciousness. He said, it's simple, it keeps your body healthy and clear. He said, we don't tell the masses about it because most people can't follow it, and we don't want them to get distracted from Krishna. He said, but if you can do it, it's the best diet for your Krishna consciousness. And also, one of the things that I had to give up when I moved in the temple was yoga practice. I did hatha yoga practice. And everybody told me that is not our yoga. Our yoga is bhakti yoga. Hatha yoga is included in that, and you don't really need to do it. Just dance and kirtan. So I was stubborn about that for a while too. And when I moved in the temple, there was just no place to do it and no time. Then when I got to be with Prabhupada, I started doing it again. I would go in the early morning, mid-morning, before doing his cooking in the backyard and do some yoga asanas. And another thing was I wanted to make sure it was okay. So I had been doing it for 2 or 3 days. And I decided I'm going to ask Prabhupada if this is okay. So, as it would be, he brought it up before I did. I cooked his lunch, and I had full intent to ask him about it that day. And when I brought his plate in, he said, I see you're doing yoga exercises in the yard. I said, yes, sir, I actually was going to ask you about that. The devotees told me that that's not bona fide, that it's not our process. And he said, actually, he said, these exercises are very good for your health. He said, we don't want anyone to become distracted, so we don't teach it. But for you, he said, it's very good, and I encourage you to do it. Then, a short time afterwards, we were in San Diego and taking a walk in the park, and there was someone doing the headstand off in the distance. And Prabhupada looked over, he said, oh, this is Shirsasana, very good for the health. He said, there are so many of these exercises, Shirsasana, Yogasana, Padmasana, he named. He said, very good for the health. And one elder godbrother, in a bit of a sarcastic tone, not towards Prabhupada, but towards yoga, said, so we should do this every day, Prabhupada? And he didn't answer him. And he just kept walking. And when he finally got back to the car, he turned around and he said, it's not necessary. And I remembered what he had told me, and I realized that he was answering the mood of the question. And that the real idea is that whatever's good for your Krishna consciousness, do it. Whatever's not good, stop it. Once I gave Prabhupada something with I think it was fresh boysenberries. And he said, oh, this is very good. What is this? And I said, well, that's called a boysenberry. It's a cross between a couple of different kinds of berries by a man named Boysen. He said, it's very good. Poisonberry? And I said, no, sir, boysenberry. And he laughed. He was joking. And so I told the devotees that story. As you know, it's one of Prabhupada's lighthearted, joking moods. And sometime later, not too long later, boysenberries were in the kitchen, and one of the Matajis said, you can't offer those, they're poisonous. Prabhupada said they're poisonous. So I told Prabhupada, I said, you had told me, you had joked with me about boysenberries and poisonberries, and now the story is out that boysenberries are poisonous. And he laughed. He said, everyone is saying Prabhupada has said this and Prabhupada has said that when I've never said. He said, believe what you hear in my books and what you hear me speak, and take everything else with a grain of salt. Another example of that was in Bombay. There's the chickpeas. How many chickpeas can we eat? So I was carrying Prabhupada's plate through the prasadam room of devotees. The devotees were at one end of the building and Prabhupada's room was at the other end. So I was taking his plate through and I heard someone say, well, you can only serve 7 chickpeas. Prabhupada told us that in New York. And somebody said, no, it's 11. I heard it in Los Angeles. Somebody else said, no, it's 21. He told us that. So I went into Prabhupada's room and I gave him his plate and I said, Srila Prabhupada, there's a controversy going on about how many chickpeas we can eat. Somebody's saying 7, someone has said 11, someone has said 21. And he gave the same answer. He said, everyone is quoting this and that and this and that. He said, again, believe what you hear from me directly and what you hear in my books. And as far as chickpeas are concerned, eat as many as you can digest. And I remember Prabhupada also took Ayurvedic medicine. He said once, the 3 things that keep me healthy are my morning walk, my massage, and the Ayurvedic medicines. So he would take every other morning he would take preparation of a big black cardamom seed pounded up in the mortar and pestle, and then 1 little pill of Jogendra Ras, which was a heart medicine made of pearls and coral and other things. I would pound up the cardamom seed, and then I would mix in the Jogendra Ras, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of honey, mix that together, and water. And it was a boat-shaped mortar, so I would just grind it up in there, and then he would drink it out of the... So one morning, I had extra honey on the teaspoon, so I put in about a 1/2 teaspoon of honey. And I thought, well, it'll just be sweeter, and, maybe Prabhupada will like it. So I took it in, and he drank it. About 5 minutes later, he rang his bell, and I came in, and he said, how much honey did you put in the medicine? And I said, well, I had a little extra on the spoon, so it's about a 1/2 teaspoon. He said, keep it at a 1/4. He said, I'm intoxicated. Prabhupada had talked about there being people in our movement who aren't devotees, that they're here for ulterior motives. And there was one person in particular on 2 occasions that he pointed out to me was of that mind. Someone who was very charismatic, very powerful, held a high position. Once he told me that he said he had been ill, and he said, all my disciples were praying for me to get well, except for this person, and he was praying for my death so he could take over. And another time you probably remember the GBC disbanding back. There was a bunch of stuff that came up. I was traveling with Prabhupada, and the information came that there had been a rezoning of the world and that different people had taken different positions, and he heard about it and he became furious. He said, this is total nonsense. And he pointed out this person. He said, this person has spearheaded this just because he wants to take over the world. And I remember at that time he said, send a telegram to every center telling them that the GBC is temporarily disbanded. The temple president is the only authority at this time until further notice. He said, you don't need to send anything to New Vrindavan, because at that time he really trusted in Kirtanananda Swami. And he also said, now call Karandar and find out what the truth is. He had implicit faith in Karandar. He turned to Karandar in many ways as an equal, as I saw it, as someone who was so totally trustworthy in his management and in his ability to be Krishna conscious around all this stuff. But this person was in Vrindavan. I was in Vrindavan 2 weeks before Prabhupada passed. And they asked me to act as his guard. So I was there as his guard and was very moved. As many devotees have probably told you, the situation was very intense, very heavy. Prabhupada's body was very frail. And Brother Bharadwaj was singing beautifully, as he always did. Prabhupada absolutely loved Bharadwaj and his singing. He would listen to Bharadwaj and Yamuna Devi, and when he would hear them sing, he would go into trance. He would just listen. Sometimes he would call me and ask me to put on the Govindam album when it was a record. And he would sit and listen to Yamuna Devi singing Govindam, and he would just go into trance. He would say, "Oh, this is so beautiful. She is such a devotional person." And he would say the same about Bharadwaj. He loved his singing. And so Bharadwaj was singing one day for Prabhupada, and it was a very somber mood. He was in his room, devotees were all gathered around, everyone was sitting on the floor except this person who was sitting on a chair. And Bharadwaj was singing and he hit a note where his voice broke. He was emotional. And this person elbowed him and laughed and made fun of his making a mistake. This person was a singer and a musician himself. And I realized that I have a situation here that I have to decide what to do. I'm Prabhupada's guard. Prabhupada has told me this person is praying for his death. I see him in that mood. What do I do? So the alternatives were there. Either kill the person or go to the senior godbrothers and share what I knew. Of course, the first one was out. So the second one, I thought about it and I thought I wouldn't be heard. He wields power and I don't in the same way. And the third alternative was to leave because I couldn't see it. I couldn't be there and see that. So I left. And at that time, Kirtanananda was there very, very sincerely spearheading the group of devotees who were begging Prabhupada to stay. Please, Prabhupada, we can't do this without you right now. We're not advanced enough. We need you here. And I remember him crying and begging Prabhupada to stay. And Prabhupada just yawned. He said, "All right, I'll stay." So because he said that, I thought he was going to stay. And I just realized I don't want to stir up trouble in this special time, and I can't watch it. So I left Vrindavan and left India. And 2 weeks later, Prabhupada passed.
Je anilo